Professor Maria Engström from Uppsala University, who is Professor of Russian Studies at Uppsala. She's talking about the Soviet underground of the 70s and 80s, which has still got implications for the politics of today. Perhaps one of its most interesting figures, well, the one that the West knows all about, is Alexander Dugin. But apart from him, there was a wide range of actors who were prominent as a counterculture in the Soviet Union. And Maria's going to talk about that culture. It reflects work she's currently engaged upon, and she's edited the Oxford Handbook of Soviet Underground Culture, from which some of this lecture will be drawn. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Danube Institute, for inviting me here for the second time. I'm happy to be here again. And so what I'm presenting today is my current research, and the book that David mentioned is going to be published in December this year. And you can check some of the articles online. So I just start, and I guess we have a conversation later and questions about it, yeah? As I understand, so thank you. One scarcely researched territory of Russian intellectual history is the system of metaphysical and occult concepts, which were popular in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and their influence on the post-Soviet culture and the contemporary political thought in Russia. So the history of esoteric movements in Soviet underground and the late Soviet political occultism is a significant component of studying the post-Soviet illiberal communities, primarily radical conservatism and traditionalism. The core of the dark Soviet underground was the Iuzhinskii Circle. This group should be counted as a Russian version of European traditionalism, since its main ideologists, like Iurii Mamleev, Geydar Dzhemal, and Evgenii Golovin, developed ideas which originated with the founders of European traditionalism in the first half of the 20th century, René Guénon and Julius Evola. And if you're interested in the history of European traditionalism, I can recommend you two books of Mark Sedgwick, who was here at the Danube Institute when I was here first time. And it's his very popular best-selling books, Against the Modern World from 2004, and this new book, which came out last week, Traditionalism, the Radical Project for Restoring Sacred Order. The metaphysical politics of the late Soviet period may also be of interest to those concerned with the so-called post-human or dark turn in contemporary Western philosophy, more specifically the movement of neo-reaction, formulated by British philosopher Nick Land as the Dark Enlightenment. But in this talk, my intent is not to focus on the parallels between neo-reaction and Russian dark conservatism, but rather to highlight a selection of texts and key ideological notes which are of great importance, both for an understanding of the dark Soviet underground and an analysis of the dark conservatism which mushroomed after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So let's go back in time. Underground saloons began to appear in Moscow after the Second World War in the 1950s. In one of these salons or circles was a two-room communal apartment of the writer Iurii Mamleev, who lived in the center of Moscow, not far from the Lenin Library. The so-called Iuzhinskii Circle, or Iurii Mamleev Salon, was formed there in 1958. Besides Mamleev himself, who immigrated to the United States in 1974 and then to Paris, the main figures of the Iuzhinskii circles were Evgenii Golovin, He was a poet, musician, translator from several European languages. He was especially fond of French poetry and European alchemy. And Geydar Dzhemal, an adherent of Islamic mysticism and theoretician of political Islam. The radical right-wing philosopher Alexander Dugin, which David mentioned, is much younger. And he is often counted among the Iuzhinskii, so members of the Iuzhinskii Circle, but he didn't take part in these legendary get-togethers on Iuzhinskii Переулок because he was not born then, but was included in the already established circle of Moscow esoterics at the very beginning of the 1980s. And here you can see this young guy, well, to the right. This is young Dugin. One of the prominent members of the Iuzhinskii Circle, Igor Dudinsky, journalist and filmmaker, notes 4 main intellectual traditions that were important for Iuzhinskii, and I quote, "In general, the ideological basis that united everyone took shape quickly. It represented the symbiosis of several traditions. First of all, Gnosticism, in the broadest possible sense, from the early pre-Christian to the late. The second component was, of course, Steinerism, included Gurdjieff and Uspensky, and at the same time, the entire Silver Age, which is Russian pre-revolutionary culture, with its affinity for decadence, black romanticism, and ecstatic erotic forms of sectarianism, plus Russian religious philosophy. And as their apotheosis, the later foreign thinkers from Eliade to Guénon. From there, things go in all directions to infinity." So the late Soviet counterculture revives the modernist tradition of the creation of zones of freedom and transgression. Moreover, these zones were created most often for one's own, in private spaces, not accessible for accidental visitors. So Igor Dudinsky tells us, an underground salon was always in an apartment or an artist studio, never in a cafe or similar publicly accessible place, which is understandable because all this was underground movements forbidden by the official Russian culture. So according to Mamleev himself, Iuzhinskii existed as if in different dimension, completely outside the reality of Soviet life. And it was an attempted revival of this pre-revolutionary Russia, with its interest in the otherworldly and the esoteric. An important characteristic of Iuzhinskii as a community was that this radical doubt included not only the Soviet system, but the contemporary world itself. So late Soviet reality was seen as just a particular instance of the cosmic crisis. Consequently, the Iuzhinskii, in contrast with to a number of other underground and dissonant Soviet communities, were not very interested in a political or social critique of the Soviet order, but focused on metaphysical concerns. So Mamleev notes, "We felt distinctly that that was a bottomless chasm beneath us, as that the whole planet was sinking into it. And at the same time, there was a feeling that it was probably necessary. Quite possibly, the planet had completed its journey in order to be reborn at the next level. We were haunted by a kind of cosmic feeling of spiritual ruin that encompassed the world, the chaos of spiritual collapse." So, the groundbreaking text of this dark Soviet underground was a minor philosophical tract from 1980 entitled Orientation North, conceived by Iuzhinskii founder and philosopher Geydar Dzhemal. Orientation North is one of the central manifestations, or manifestos of Soviet occulture, a metaphysical manual of sorts. The book's cult status was a result of its ontology of undergroundness, a radical state of nihilism and outsideness. In the course of the work, Dzhemal describes what he calls a methodology for carrying out metaphysical revolution against the unjust kingdom of the absolute. So orientation consists of 24 chapters, and unfortunately this text is not translated into English, but there is a group of young scholars of Russian who are translating this book right now, so it will be available soon. And each chapter includes 72 clauses, which normally consist of one sentence. In its aphoristic and laconic form, it is kind of stylization and maybe subversion of Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus from 1921. It contains almost no arguments, preferring the mode of the maxim. So in this work, Dzhemal develops a new language along with a novel corpus of concepts, for example, harlequin, parabolic invasion, beyond being, inner corpse, the absolute, the otherwise, which are then taken up by broad circles of Soviet artists, Soviet writers, musicians of the Moscow underground in the 70s and 80s. And they were used as code words for the initiated. In the 90s, these watchwords would serve as a tinder for a burgeoning counterculture of radical conservatives, represented by, for example, Alexander Dugin, Eduard Limonov, and the National Bolshevik Party, which I will talk about later. So in the text of Orientation North, one immediately perceives a gnostic line of enmity towards matter, as well as a notion of awakening, as it is respectively propounded by Gurdjieff and Evola. In opposing the self-identity of the absolute, Dzhemal provides an alternative philosophy of radical otherness and non-identity. In other words, he describes a model of awakened consciousness that is separate from all objects and matter. According to the idea, mind and matter, or subject and object, are non-contiguous ontological orders. They are utterly independent and cannot be conjoined. So the concept of North, so this is how the text looks like. So this concept of North enjoyed a marked popularity among the members of Moscow's metaphysical underground. And according to Dzhemal, North is not to be understood geographically, even if metaphors of the cold, freezing, lifelessness are widely evoked by the dark underground and its contemporaries, such as, for example, representatives of Russian alt art and a significant expression of this poetics of North can be found in this Novosibirsk series by leading artists of this community, Alexei Beloyev-Gintoff. In Dzhemal's tract, North is the revolutionary opposition to the bestial world of phenomena, of clay and the South. North is the vector of heroes who rise against the evil absolute and the harlequin, its deputy on earth. North is approach towards absolute zero, the place where all things end and all life created by the evil absolute cools down. So it's another example of this art. So I quote from Dzhemal's book. North represents the rupture within continuous existence. In the face of this pole, existence seizes and turns back on its heels. North is the pole of the impossible. Being outside of experience, North has no common measure with existence. Therefore, it is rooted in the absurd. He who travels north does not fear the night, because light is absent in the skies of the north. The concept of a man apart, or man of the north, was borrowed by Dzhemal from Julius Evola. Dzhemal also follows Guénon, admitting that north is not only the impoverishment of reality or the point which opposes the world. North is also the feminine manifestation of the cosmos, that female orientation which places the subject who casts his glance towards the north in the masculine position. Consequently, those who turn towards the south, the main male pole of the cosmos, take the passive feminine position. Orientation towards the north as a feminine manifestation of the cosmos, with the goal of achieving sacred masculinity, is reflected in the work of another Iuzhinskii leader, Evgenii Golovin. In both his lectures and his book, Approaching the Ice Queen, on the basis of alchemical and occult literature, European romanticism, and black fantasy, Golovin develops the topic of poles as zones of unhuman. In orientation north, the ethos of non-identity with the mainstream and that of the underground reaches a scale that far exceeds any mere political or cultural protest against Soviet rule. The Soviet regime is seen as an element of the rule of Harlequin or Pharaoh, that is the deputy of the evil great creature, the absolute. In the late 90s, Dzhemal develops Dzhemal develops a concept to which he refers as political post-traditionalism, through which he combines a philosophy of protest against the absolute with monotheism, and he calls it political Islam. In general, a vivid trait of the dark underground as it existed during the Soviet breakdown was its transition from purely metaphysical protest to a political one, in light of which great attention was paid to Russia's role in the global historical process. So this turn is typical for all participants of the Iuzhinskii Circle: Mamleev, Dugin, Dzhemal, to a lesser extent Golovin. In 1991, Dugin initiates the Neo-Eurasian movement, and in 1993, Dzhemal established a religious social organization known as the Islamic Committee of Russia. So according to Dzhemal and Dugin, there is a direct connection between the world of ideas and that of politics. By way of radical political acts, one influences the dimension of the metaphysical and the sacred. So the prophets, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, along with their followers, become the agents of protest in Dzhemal's political post-traditionalism. And Dzhemal sees Russia, so here his book, Revolution of Prophets. So Dzhemal sees Russia as the only power which can stand in the way of a single government, that modern deputy of Iblis. So Russia as a nation of Boreas, the true north, is the god which holds this line. So according to Dzhemal, because Russia is close to the axis mundi, the law of karma does not hold sway there. Meanwhile, karma serves as a center of ontological reality for the absolute. So he writes, Russia is a zone in which karma has a minimal function. It's a zone of high metaphysical lawlessness. As a result, the great creature, Satan or Iblis, enjoys very little influence in the territory of Russia. Because the world lives under the law of Iblis, lawlessness is a project of freedom, according to Dzhemal. And in 1997, Dugin developed his vision of metaphysical politics and published an article entitled Katechon and Revolution, in which he introduced Carl Schmitt's political theological notion of the katechon to his audience. It is this concept which shows the basis for his own theory of Russia as a katechon, Christian imperial katechon, the last remaining power on earth that can withhold the arrival of the Antichrist and the commencement of the apocalypse. In this sense, both Dugin and Dzhemal situate Russia as the center of all global process. However, Dugin does so within the framework of Christian eschatology. One of the most important communities of Russian dark conservatism was the National Bolshevik Party, NBP, founded in 1993 by Alexander Dugin, writer Eduard Limonov, and two avant-garde musicians, Yegor Letov and Sergei Kuryokhin. And this community was interested in Western esoteric and occult subcultures and secret societies, especially Aleister Crowley. In 1995, Dugin writes his essay about Crowley, which is called A Man with a Falcon Beak, Человек с соколиным клювом. And in this essay, Dugin briefly lays out Crowley's esoteric doctrine, according to which humanity is experiencing the end of the Aeon of Osiris and will soon enter into the Aeon of Horus. Between the Aeon of Osiris, the patriarchal order, and the Aeon of Horus, the order of total freedom, is a particularly dangerous interval that Crowley calls the storm of the equinox. This is an epoch of chaos, revolutions, wars, catastrophe, terrible but necessary in order to clean out a place for something new. The task of the Crowley adherent is to be an agent of Horus and bring this aeon closer, in spite of all the danger of the transition. So according to Dugin, Crowley particularly emphasized modern art as tool of the storm of the equinox. And the more transgressive, insane, destructive, and anarchic it is, the sooner the Aeon of Horus will arrive. So Dugin writes, homoeroticism, drugs, intense operative magic, avant-garde music, super perverted erotic comatose practices, for phosphorescent painting of madness, political extremism, all of this is laid out in detail, systemized, concentrated, predetermined in Aleister Crowley's teaching of Thelema. Whether we like it or not, whether we know about it or not, we all live under his sign, his oversight, according to his commandments. A bloody and cruel bird, the falcon, the Egyptian symbol of Horus. So beginning in the perestroika period, Soviet and post-Soviet occulture, in the persons of Golovin, Mamleev, Dzhemal, Dugin, Kuryokhin, Letov, Limonov, Pelevin, and Prokhanov, and many, many more, is very famous Russian writers, musicians, which influenced Russian culture enormously. The ideas adopted at one time from the texts of Western traditionalism, esotericism, and occultism, but reworked and adapted to a new historical moment, are today being actively exported back to the West, where they are already being accepted as doctrines of Russian intellectual illiberalism and dark enlightenment. So the modern interest in the Iuzhinskii Circle that is appearing in a growing number of journalistic and scholarly publications is caused not least by the global crisis of rational thought and the politicization of transgression. In the Soviet context, it wasn't the liberal, but specifically the radical conservative underground, under the direct influence of Western culture, that was the most transgressive. Today, the Iuzhinskii Circle and the countercultural communities and movements of the post-Soviet period connected to it, for example, the New Academy, Necro-realism, already mentioned, National Bolshevik Party, Neo-Eurasianism, attracted interest as avant-garde for their time and for Russian context, as avant-garde zone of transgressive artistic and life experimentation, and as an example of the strategy of individual and collective liberation from dominant ideological and biopolitical control. I think I can stop here and then we can continue our discussion. Thank you very much. Shall I move?
Yeah. Well, that was very illuminating. So in terms of the kind of thinking that was going on in the Russian underground, it was, from what you're saying, like highly syncretic, bringing together lots of ideas that were like, outside the mainstream, but coming from various sources, many of them based on Christian Gnosticism, but also pagan thinking, and culminating in someone like Aleister Crowley, who was known as the Beast in London. Do you think there was, did this cultic phenomenon how did the Russian authorities address it? Did they ignore it, or?
I don't think they knew about it.
They didn't know about it.
No, because the way these communities functioned, it was a like a private communication. People, they all were friends. They invited each other to their dachas or their apartments, and they had a drink and talk and discussions. So it was a way of life. It was not an organized movement. It was not visible actually for the outsiders. It was very close community of friends, which communicated as we can do when we discuss something. So that's why I think there were no reaction from the Soviet authorities. And then, as I mentioned, Iurii Mamleev, who was kind of the organizer of the circle, a very famous Russian writer, he emigrated to the United States and then to Paris. So he was out. So in a way, the circle was continued as a not as a circle, but as a kind of group meetings. But what is important that its influence was very indirect but very powerful. And it has to do how the late Soviet culture worked, actually, and it's a separate topic.
So obviously left a legacy, which still continues now.
Absolutely. The legacy is now being really in demand. So we see the books of Dzhemal, Golovin, all these persons, Mamleev, who I mentioned, who are completely unknown for the West, but they're getting more and more attention in Russia. So the books are being reprinted. And I see how in the West, young scholars are kind of discovering this legacy and this hidden culture. So they start translating these books into English. So it's very timely that we speak about it, actually.
But I mean, some of them, you said Mamleev left for the States. Several others went to the States, didn't they? Like Lermonov.
Yes, another person which, if you don't know, I suggest you look and closely to him, is a writer and political figure, Eduard Limonov. He, as a Mamleev, he left in 1973, I think, to the United States, and then he hated it there, so he came back. He went to Paris, so and established himself as a writer in Paris. Actually, there is a very good biography of Eduard Limonov written by a French author, and now they're producing a film about him.
So he detested New York, but a number of them sort of seem to be interested by Western counterculture as well.
Yes, and then there are some other...
like Andy Warhol was...
Yeah, it was already after Perestroika. Wow. So you have to remember that this late Soviet culture was very dynamic, and every 5 years it was kind of new situation. So as you remember, 1985, Gorbachev introduced Perestroika. So it was a cultural revolution. It was much more easier for all these underground movements to become visible and become very popular. In the late 80s, so it's not the same situation as the 70s, of course. Right. So this young generation of this late Soviet undergrounds, they had contact with Americans and European musicians and artists. And one of the connections was to Andy Warhol, and it was the Leningrad underground and music circles, which became kind of... they became the most popular contemporary Russian artists and musicians that we know.
And that was from the 80s onwards, from the mid-80s onwards?
Yeah, it's from the 80s. It's when all these things were formulated, And actually, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, as I mentioned, all these cultural circles were purely, within the sphere of culture, they became politicized, they became political, because they didn't like the way Russia developed in the 90s, all this aggressive capitalism. Because, they were artists. Yeah. They didn't like this bourgeois order.
So the National Bolshevik Party formed in the 90s? Yes,
it was formed by Dugin, Limonov, and these avant-garde musicians, 1993.
To promote that kind of anti-capitalist line?
Definitely, it's usually described as radical right, but I should describe it as a mixture of right and left, actually. So it's the social protest was leftist, but the culture that they promoted was more connected to the conservative European culture. So it was mixture.
And their influence now is what?
Their influence is, it's not directly that they influence Putin, you know, all this discourse of Dugin being Putin's brain, and so
That's nonsense.
It's really nonsense, because they operate on different levels, you know. This is, Dugin is a countercultural figure. So his radicalism in his formulation comes from this background. It's the way they used to talk. It's a special language. It's not a bureaucratic, you know, language of Putin or bureaucrats, Soviet bureaucrats or post-Soviet bureaucrats. So, but how culture works, ideas that are produced by small avant-garde groups, and it's not only in Russia, it's everywhere, they are then, you know, getting popular among broader masses. And that's how the influence works. So it's not directly Dugin or Limonov to Putin, but they influence popular culture very much. And then this popular culture, of course, is spread all over Russia. Millions, you know, people listen to this music, read these books, millions. And of course it forms public opinion. And then this public opinion in its turn affects the authorities, and they had to listen to it. So it's more this way.
So would there be a particular party in Russia at the moment that would reflect this sort of thinking?
No, it's all within the sphere of culture, and the sphere of it influences the identity, and it's very. You know, it's very subtle how the things work. There is not political parties that promote these ideas, but as I already said, there are movies, there are exhibitions, there are public discussions, and because Russian culture is very, you know, if in the West political figures are very important, they produce the discourse. In Russia, it's writers, and it works in a different way. It's writers and philosophers. They are the producers of even political discussions and so on. So it's that's why these figures are important.
Okay. Well, that's so. Some questions from the audience. That was a fascinating talk, actually. First, Rod, and then Jeff.
Hey, thank you for your lecture. In the United States, where I come from, since COVID, in Orthodox parishes, I'm Orthodox, we've seen an influx of young men who come saying they're seeking orthodoxy, but in fact, it looks like they're seeking some form of Duginism, a Christianized form of Duginism. Can you talk about the role of the Russian Orthodox Church vis-a-vis Duginism and the sort of dark conservatism you're talking about?
Thank you. Actually, thank you for your question. As well, I didn't mention it, the development of all this post-Soviet development, because some of these figures, like Dugin, he became Orthodox. So he writes about political orthodoxy. So there, I think, how he influences this young man. And for the Orthodox Church, he is not a figure to listen to at all. So there is this kind of underground Orthodox movements where he is an important figure, but for the official Orthodox Church, he's not so important. But after the war started and his daughter was killed, he came closer to the more officials of the Russian Orthodox Church, and now his daughter, there is a street named after his daughter in Donetsk, I think. So it's a new development, I should say.
May I
follow up? Yeah.
I was talking with a North American Orthodox friend last weekend, and he said that the priests in America have no idea what they're dealing with when these young men come in. These young men who have read, American men, who have read Dugin and who are ready to fight, but the priests don't know what's going on. What advice would you give them for how to deal with these young men?
Well, I think for the first time, first of all, they have to read some of Dugin's writing about this political orthodoxy and how his notion of Russian Christian katechon, this katechon narrative is the most important. Because I mentioned it a little bit, and I mentioned it last time I was here, I was talking about it actually, the concept of katechon, and how it became, that's where the influence of Dugin is, really, we can see influence of Dugin on the official politics of Russia. Because I had an article published 10 years ago, how these concepts entered the foreign policy concept from, it was 2013. So there is an influence, but it goes, as you mentioned, from the so the Orthodox way, from the Orthodox Church and politicization of Orthodoxy. So they can read Dugin concept of katechon and then maybe criticize it from the point of Orthodox doctrine.
Because from Dugin's perspective, the catechon comes from the Orthodox Church via Schmidt, doesn't it? And Schmidt's view, like Dugin's, is that the catechon is the protection against the Antichrist, which is America.
Yes,
it's the maritime powers for Schmidt.
Yes, and that's what these terms that I used, it's Dzhemal as well, the term, the absolute, the evil absolute. It's a metaphysical force. It's a metaphysical evil force, and it has its deputies. It's deputate, so deputies. It's the absolute deputies, or the pharaoh's deputies. They are all over Earth. But of course, according to Dugin,
it's mainly America.
Yeah, it's mostly America. Yeah.
Jeff, you want? Oh, sorry. Is there a microphone? Sorry.
Yeah, it was a fascinating talk. Thank you. It's a subject I'm very much interested in. And maybe it's less a question than the fact that I know so little about the Russian underground. And it seems to fit into a larger pattern. And the pattern, going back to James Billington and Fire in the Minds of Men, the 18th century esoteric underground, and it's basically escapist. It's something that has no political reality at all. It's a way to get away from the dominant culture, to re-examine erotic social mores, and to remagicalize the world. And then in a you'll get second generation believers who come in and take these ideas and retranslate them into political terms, which in the 20th century tended to be classical fascism and now radical populism. But it seems to fit that pattern with a kind of Soviet twist, in that there was, as we've talked about before, this kind of internal migration that everybody was involved in virtually, especially the young people and intellectuals, where in socialist times, you would create your own imaginary world, one of which was metaphysical, esoteric, it could be movies, it could be absolutely anything. And it seems to fit into those broader patterns. And I was wondering if I'm right about that, what you would think about that.
Yes, absolutely. You're absolutely right. It was the part of the Iuzhinskii Circle, it was to create this imaginary world outside this boring Soviet reality. You can imagine it was after the Second World War. The conditions for young men in Moscow and in the Soviet Union, they were horrible. So they didn't accept then when Khrushchev and the Thaw started. And it was all this, Soviet progressism, the space project and everything. It was really the bright future. But these people, they didn't believe in bright future. So they wanted another type of future. And so they imagined and created these enchanted worlds, which with with inspiration from the forbidden books and forbidden art, the Western esoteric tradition. And Dzhemal and Golovin, they remember how they found all these books of, for example, René Guénon. It was in open sources in Lenin library, but nobody was interested in it. So they could order these books, they could read them, and then the whole new world appeared, and they started to work in this imaginary world. And it worked very fine until the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the reality came in. And so they had to rethink how we continue with our imaginary production now, when it's all, okay, you can do whatever you want, nobody cares. So that's how the political comes.
So they start off as radical transgressives, really, don't they? And now they're sort of orthodox somehow.
Well, I should not say, as you say, it's not kind of, normal, so to say, normal Orthodox people with traditional values. No. They are still transgressive. So I think the whole concept of Russia's catechons that are here to stop the United States from, it's a transgressive idea. It's not that usual people want to hear, because nobody wants to live in this apocalyptic fight. Normal people just want to have a normal life. So it's
Thank you very much for your lecture, which opened a whole new world for me. What I found also refreshing is that you abstained from any judgment, and you more described, like matter-of-fact style, what these people were thinking. However, at the same time, I do wonder why should we study this? Like, is it more to understand Russian society under Soviet times or at the present times? Or would you also say that these people have something to teach us in the West? Because, for me, I find it very hard to make sense of this. Like, to see, like, okay, it is interesting in its openness to all kinds of ideas and so on, but it also seems completely irrational and go in all directions and so on. So maybe you have some ideas about this.
Well, I'm a scholar of Russian culture, and I study Russian intellectual history. So for me, it has a value in itself to study all the circles because of their influence that we already mentioned. It's not just marginal persons, so we can read their books or not to read their books. These people are influential. They influence contemporary Russian culture and political thinking a lot. That's why I think it's important that we go back and we see the roots, how this movement has developed, what the inspiration comes from. And it also tells us, if you're interested in history of Russian culture, it tells us how Russian culture works in its connection to the West. Because, and it's usually from the Peter the Great's time, from the 18th century. Russians take some ideas from the West, they reshape them, they do something else with them, and then they re-export them. We can say it with Marxism as well. And now it's something like that with these ideas. The Dugin, as we know, very popular in the United States and many countries all over the globe. So I think we should study these ideas to understand where this comes from, and then how. So even if it seems kind of irrational, this irrational thinking is a part of our life, actually, because we live in post-secular times. This post-secularity, it comes in different shapes. It can be the return to traditional orthodoxy, to traditional Catholicism, but it also can be the return to irrational models of thinking like this one, because, So,
and you saw a connection to going back to the Silver Age in Russia, in imperial period.
Yes,
there's a sort of
yes,
a line.
Yes, there is another line. There is this Western line, the Aleister Crowley and Evola, Guénon, Eliade, all this European tradition of resistance to the kind of Enlightenment. But there is a similar Russian line, pre-revolutionary Russian Orthodox religious philosophy is very important. So they because it was an anti-Soviet movement, it was an anti-Soviet circle. It was a dissident circle. Yeah. But we usually think of dissidents as good guys. But maybe we can start thinking of dissidents as the bad guys as well. So they were reading all what was forbidden in the Soviet Union. So all this stuff, even Russian Silver Age was forbidden, if you remember. Yeah. During the Soviet times, we couldn't read, Bulgakov. He was distributed as a dissident, samizdat. We forget about it because now it's all possible. But I remember in the 90s, when I was still a teenager, when it was possible to read Solzhenitsyn and Bulgakov and Silver Age poets, it was a revolution for us. It was
I mean, Solzhenitsyn becomes an interesting figure here. Yeah. I mean, did they read Solzhenitsyn? What was his relationship to? He hated America as well, didn't he? He made that famous speech at Harvard.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing. These Russian Soviet dissidents, they hate the Soviet Union. And when they get a chance to leave, they go to the United States. And then they continue hating, this system. They didn't like it there either. So it's so Russian culture of dissident protest, it's always against the mainstream. Actually, it doesn't matter if it's Soviet, Russian, American, French, or whatever, British, because they find the weaknesses in the system, the official, mainstream system, and then they want to so to say, research everything which mainstream doesn't offer. So that's how I think it works. Yeah.
Jeff, you wanted to.
Yeah, just as a follow-up to answer your question, I think, because it was a very good one. And it's one you hear in intelligence, military, and diplomatic circles all the time when they're looking at, say, the Iranian Revolution as one practical example, Putin's kind of populism now, and they say it's irrational, therefore they must be crazy, but in the end, we don't understand what they're doing. And so the very value of this kind of research is to understand that there are other rationalities other than Western. And if you can understand them, if you know their origins, you can predict where they're going. And you can deal with them in the real world in a much more effective way than simply thinking, wow, that's esoteric, it's madness, we don't get it. And I can tell you, having been in Iran during the revolution, there was a lot of that. And it was so obvious what was happening. Everybody understood it but the West. So you really need to be able to go outside of yourself and see the world through the eyes of the actors you're trying to understand. And what Maria's doing is basically bringing that to light in Western terms. So it's really quite brilliant stuff.
So there's a question there from.
Yes, that's for me. Hello. I would like to ask the professor. Dugin has a pretty popular work called the Fourth Political Theory. So can you explain to us what it is? And apparently there were 3 political theories before it. So what were they?
Yeah, it wasn't. Well, actually, I didn't want to talk about Dugin today because there are other figures, but okay. Yes, it's a very influential concept. And what Dugin is offering there, it's a philosophy, political philosophy for the future, for the 21st century. Because usually when we talk about all these circles today, they are referred as Russian fascists. And what he's saying to us is in this book is that fascist communism and classical liberalism, they are the philosophical models of the 20th century, of the age of modernity. Now we are in the new age. And the new age needs a new political theory, a political metaphysical theory, because it's always for Dugin, it's connected. So that's what he offers there. And it's a mixture of elements from these three traditions from the 20th century. And basically what he is offering there is the continuation of these ideas, actually. It's not so much new. It's very typical for Dugin. He labels his ideas differently, but the core is the same. Before it was called Neo-Eurasianism, now it's the fourth political theory, but it's still the same. Yeah. So, but I suggest you read it because it's a separate topic about.
It's a long book.
It's yeah.
But the first three are sort of liberalism, Marxism, fascism, and then the fourth is sort of syncretic, but it ends up in Eurasianism.
Yeah.
Which is not nationalism.
It's not nationalism. That's very important to remember because Dugin is often referred as a Russian nationalist, but it's completely wrong. If you read him, listen to him, he talks about Eurasianism, and it's a continuation. You can say it's continuation of Russian imperial thinking, but broader. And it's a system which I think gains popularity because it's open to other civilizations. It doesn't say that the Russian or Eurasian civilization is the only one, is the best. It just says it's one of these major important civilizations of the world, and which all have right to exist in their own, form, with their own concepts. So in this way, it is a critique of Western universalism, and that's why it gets criticized in the West. Because it kind of says that, well, you're not the only ones. There is this Eurasian civilization, there is Iranians, there is Chinese, and so on. So, and this system fits this the political concept of multipolar world, which is promoted. Right. So that's why you should maybe read it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Sorry, is that okay? You mentioned the Silver Age briefly. I was thinking of figures like Andrei Bele, Valery Brusov. They definitely show a society in rupture. I mean, Bele particularly talks about assassins and anarchists. Is it fair to characterize this movement as nihilistic, and does that tendency connect meaningfully to what people like Dugin and the broader group are doing today?
Didn't understand. If there is a connection between the Silver Age poets and contemporary.
If their valorization of destruction is a theme that has a big purchase on today's thinkers.
Yeah, because Silver Age was a culture. It was an apocalyptic culture before the Russian Revolution. All these poets, artists, they felt that something is wrong and something is going to explode. So the Silver Age culture fits very well to this apocalyptic, ethos of these groups. So there is definitely similarity between. That's why they were interested in all these poets. For example, Bloch was very important. The Scythians, this poem about the Russian role in the global process and Russian as a keeper of the door to apocalypse. So definitely, it's a very interesting culture, and there is a lot of parallels there.
So, Melissa, we've got you the microphone.
Maria,
so we have Melissa, Eric, and then Logan.
That was very excellent. Thank you. I was listening this morning to Professor Stephen Kotkin, and he was discussing, there's a school of thought that we have invited the invasion because we pushed the expansion of NATO beyond their red line, blah, blah, blah. But he rejects it because he says this is just the pattern of Russian behavior, that they are always doing this expansionary thing, and only very few times have they been successful, for example, in the defeat of Charles II in the 18th century. So is there something that this is tied into, that it supports this kind of feeling that, they're entitled to go out and tromp over their neighbors?
Well, of course, what I discussed was many, many years ago, these ideas. But the idea, what we saw, I discussed a little bit, Dzhemal, Russia being the territory that keeps the apocalypse away. And the larger the territory, actually, the stronger the chance that the apocalypse won't come. So there is actually a connection between these ideas and the geographical territory of Russia. So we can discuss this on different levels. There is this absolutely mystical, metaphysical one, where Russia has to be on this the heartland, the territory, and cannot lose its territory, because if it loses territory, it will affect the coming apocalypses. So this is one level. And then there is another level which is connects to this concept of political orthodoxy and katechon as well. The larger the katechon, the better. So there is definitely a connection to the pure imperial expansion. Yeah.
Because it comes back to your point that this thinking is, or Dugin's thinking, is not nationalist. It's kind of imperialist at its core.
Yeah, definitely it's not national, because nationalism is forbidden in Russian Federation, but it's imperial nationalism. Well, we don't have actually a term for this, and this question is discussed among scholars all the time. What is it? What kind of imperialism is that? But this imperial nationalism, which is not a nationalism, but it's kind of choir of different nations that were united by one idea, and this idea is the idea of katechon. So that's how.
Well, may I propose the label pan-regionalist, civilizationalist imperialism? Because and it is actually in that regard, Russia isn't so. The Russian intellectual landscape isn't the outlier, because in fact around the world there are all kinds of pan-regionalist movements which go back to the 19th century and early 20th century. But what interests me in this pan-Russian imperialist thinking is that it centers on that it has one of its tropes is the North, which is really interesting because in Europe there was the notion of the West at some point in the 19th century, and then simultaneously thinkers in Japan and in China were developing the notion of the harmonious East. But then these Russian thinkers come in and they have the North. But actually, the Nazis came out of the Nazi Party came out of the Thule-Gesellschaft, and Thule is a reference to the furthest north. And I happen to know that in France in the 80s. Far-right thinkers also had this notion of a northern civilization, which was also an anti-immigration rhetoric in the French context. Now, when Dugin talks about the North, I'm sure that he is all over the Thule-Gesellschaft and he knows his Nazi literature. But you've been saying that actually the notion of the North goes back at least until the 80s in the Soviet Union. So maybe it's also an endogenous intellectual trend to conceptualize the North. And I'm thinking about what does this do once you say that the North is your metaphysical principle that keeps away the absolute evil in the world and keeps the proper order in the world together. I wonder how do you see the significance of this axial change from west-east towards north-south?
Well, I don't know if I can answer this question, but what I can see now, this idea of North, which was proposed by Dzhemal and was really popular in the Soviet underground circles. Now, after the war, when we have when Russia faces a problem of reimagining itself as a civilization, because if you remember, for the past 500 years, Russia adopted everything from the West, from Europe. It was famous open window. Peter the Great opened the window to Europe, but it was really before it as well. So now this window is closing. So Russia has to come up with a civilizational idea which is non-Western. And here we have a few options now on the table. And actually, if you read the new foreign policy concept, which was published 2 months ago, it's 2023 foreign policy concept for the Russian Federation, you will see all these trends. And this Russian, for the first time in history, of post-Soviet history, Russia is defined not as a state, not as a country, but as a country civilization. It's a huge shift. It's a huge shift. So this civilizational discourse, from being popular in these circles like Dugin's, who produced the civilizational discourse for 30 years, now is entering official Russian policy. And so there are two options, as a Eurasian empire and as a civilization of the North. Yes. So, and Dmitry Trenin, I don't know if you know, it's a very influential political thinker and the head of Moscow Carnegie Institute. So he formulated it after he commented on this new foreign policy concept, and he formulated it that Russia now, young Russian diplomats and political thinkers has to develop an idea of Russia as the North. So we will see now in the coming years which idea will prevail, the Eurasian one, because it's one option, or the Russia as the civilization of the North. So, yeah, it's very interesting.
And you said when we were talking that universities and schools are doing Russian civilization now.
Yes, and it's also September this year. So you see, I told you yesterday, we had our talk, that I see what's going on now. It's a new Russian revolution. It's a new Russian cultural revolution, because now Russia has to reformulate what it is to create a new national identity which is not connected to the West, because now it's turning east and turning north. So, and now they're introducing in September this year a mandatory course in all Russian universities, which is called Основа российской государственности, the foundation of Russian statehood, which part of it, the model will be Russian civilization. So these ideas will be, mandatory to study for young people from the age 16 onwards in all Russian universities. So,
Maria, what are you doing September the 21st and 22nd?
Yeah, I know.
You're going to be at the geopolitical conference to talk about this.
Yeah, and it's completely new things. It's been like very fast, because they had a conference February this year about Russia DNA. What is Russia? So they formulated that now it's time to have this course, and it's the top level. So they're doing it program very, very fast. Yes. So it's a new Russian revolution.
Logan.
You just mentioned with schools and education. In terms of policy making, do you see any institutionalization of dark conservatism?
Well, definitely. I think if it's been there for past 10 years, I know exactly when it all started to be official policy in 2013. When Putin came back 2012, so-called Putin's conservative turn, and then the new foreign policy concept from 2013 already has almost all the elements of this conservative thinking. But now it's getting even more and more conservative, but in the terms of Russia being the center and the leader, not only of the conservative revolution, but also anti-colonial. So it's a mixture. They actually want to cover both the conservative circles in the West and these new multipolar movements all over the world.
So, Adam.
Thank you for your lecture. It was absolutely fascinating. My questions might seem a little bit provocative, but it is absolutely serious. My question would be, is that if they were taking drugs or not? And if they did, if it influenced their thoughts or not? Thank you.
Well, they were heavy drinkers. Well, about drugs, define drug. What is that? Well, of course they were taking drugs.
But mainly it was vodka.
Well, maybe Russian drug vodka. No, it's actually a very interesting question, and they developed the philosophy of transgression, or to say that they wanted to put themselves in this,
states.
In the states, to be able to access the metaphysical world dimension. So it was a plan. So they worked hard.
So there's a lot of acid, really.
No. If you think of the Soviet Union, the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, well, mostly it was alcohol. Actually, it was not so much else available. And Evgenii Golovin, he developed this poetry of water. So this philosophy of water, where water, and of course we know what water means. Yeah. So that this liquid state of your mind, gives you possibility to see the world in a different light. So it's a separate but very good question. Yes, it's. We could have a separate lecture on this culture.
Well, maybe it's time to hit the booze then. So it was a fascinating lecture. I think we all enjoyed that tremendously. So
thank you so much. Thank you.